First, I will start with Sarah Baker, right? She's the coordinator of the Take Back the Tech, an international campaign reclaiming technology to prevent violence against women. Thank you for being here, Sara.
Thank you.
And now I'm turning to Soraya Chemlay, who is the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project and the organizer of the Safety and Free Speech Coalition. And I will have like 2 questions, and then we will, go on to chatting about it for a little while. And someone is keeping time? Okay, go ahead. All right. So I want to actually start with 2 things that came up in the previous conversation. One is around power, right, defines language. And men who are in power have defined culture. So can you talk to both the media and technology aspect around how are you making space, right, to have a conversation about women's equality in this context?
I think that's a great question. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is specifically about something around violence against women. One of the things that technology has been very useful for is in allowing us to share our own stories about the violence that has happened to us. I think before that, if we wanted to hear stories of women experiencing violence, those stories were mediated by institutions, whether it was the media or law enforcement or courts. But thanks to the internet, and specifically social media, we get to hear women's stories of violence in their own words, and stories of other discrimination, and a lot to do with gender. But I think it's critical that now we are really shaping the overall conversation of violence against women. We're shaping the narrative. We're moving that narrative towards what we want it to be. It's very survivor-driven, I think. And those, watching women tell those stories, I mean, there's so many ways that they do it. It could be through, I've seen girls in India talking about sexual assault by using filters on Snapchat, to writing blogs, to tweeting on hashtags. People talk about how hashtag activism is really lazy, but if you participated in the Yes All Women hashtag, for example, it certainly felt much the opposite of lazy. In many cases, it was very difficult for many women, and it was vital. So that's the biggest thing that I think about, is how we are able to shape the narrative around women's rights now in a way that we couldn't before because of technology.
Sure. I have to admit, I think of this as a structural issue, and I don't really make a distinction between tech and media. So what we're seeing in the tech world is a lot of big companies saying we're not media companies, which is ridiculous, right? So if we just accept the fact that that's ridiculous, we can maybe have a better conversation. Because these companies that are now distributing our news, they're taking information from old school media and distributing it in unprecedented ways, are moderating that content every day. 24 hours a day, with armies of people and algorithms, they continue to decide what it is people see and hear. And so I agree entirely with Sara that we have this unprecedented ability to share stories. But at the same time, what we have is an unprecedented ability to spread violence. So when women share these stories, there is almost always a retaliatory threat that sometimes spills into physical violence, which is probably why I'm here, right? I mean, I started writing about these things after years of not writing, and the minute I started writing, threats were profusely made. And my experience is common. If you are a woman, if you're talking about feminism, if you're talking about violence, if you're talking about rape, if you're talking about the wage gap, if you're talking about your shoes getting wet, it doesn't really matter. If you're actually in these spaces, in a public forum, you are now more permeable to those pressures. And we see it across all the knowledge-producing spaces online. So whether it's Wikipedia or Twitter or Reddit or Facebook, we're seeing a similar dynamic, which is very old, which is drumming women out of public space through violence, but scaled up. So the metrics that we see in the structure of media, 65% of our headlines are written by men, 85% of managers are men, 97% of the owners of licenses are men. Those are worse in tech. 90% of engineers are men. So if you think very broadly about what constitutes media, which I think is useful to us as feminists, I think we should be including everything. Textbooks, T-shirts, code. This is really important. Code is being written that is reproducing systemic biases constantly and pervasively, and we don't have mechanisms for algorithmic accountability. And that's all bad, except I think it represents real opportunities for feminists to actually influence things at scale. So all the negative aspects, the small world networks that we saw were very effectively leveraged against progressive causes in this election, those work in our favor. That's why Sara and I are even here. So in 2013, I organized, along with 2 other women, a global campaign to get Facebook to accurately recognize images of violence against women, rape and domestic violence, as misogyny, as graphic violence, by their own guidelines. We weren't even asking them to change their guidelines. Their guidelines were written. It's just that images that we were being sent and were talking about were written off as jokes. Like they technically, legally put a parenthetical that said humor on images of women being raped and beaten up, or pages called I kill bitches. So that's a way of redefining language that wasn't available to us before. That's a way of flipping a switch on a global network, which is what we did, that wasn't available to us before. So I think that while the power and the structure remains solidly male-dominated and patriarchal, I do think we do have tools that we didn't have before, which is good.
So now I want to actually go back to us beginning, where Anne-Marie said that, what we need is feminist institutional reform, right? So how do you think this can happen in media and the tech world?
Well, one of the biggest things I would say is that there's a lot of women's rights activism that is happening offline and isn't moving online as well. Not that it needs to be just online, but it needs to be in both arenas. And when we talk about institutional, for one thing, at the, was it last year, the 20th anniversary of the Beijing meeting, we had APC, the organization I work for, we had staff there on the ground trying to influence advocacy around Section J, women in the media. And then I was working on social media trying to get all these activists who were there paying attention to what was going on Twitter to understand how important Section J is, because they need to pay attention to how the media affects their work and how technology affects their work. As Soraya said, those are kind of one and the same. And so whenever we are doing any work, we have to look at the role of technology. We have to do our women's rights activism offline and online. We have to look at how we're safe offline and online and where our vulnerabilities are as activists. And as much as we can strengthen that, then we can target the institutions better. And of course, another part of that is in terms of governance, working on internet governance, we need more women in decision-making roles there, so we're pushing that. I think that we can use technology. Soraya talked about the sort of double-edged sword that we have, where we have this benefit and we have these dangers, and we have to always be aware of those as activists. And in terms of who is making decisions within institutions, we need to be pushing those to recognize how their decisions affect women. So how technology, how code is written in a way that has gender biases in it. When all of the software engineers are men, they aren't considering women's needs. And that can lead to more violence against women. We see it time after time.
So I'll give you a really startling example of that. On a not harmful basis, when Apple released its health tracker, it didn't include tracking menstruation. right? So that meant women had to go buy separate period apps, right? But that same concept is why when a woman asks Siri, maybe it's been fixed now, asks Siri, I've been raped, what can I do? Siri responds, I don't know what you mean. Right? And those are the obvious ones. Those aren't, for example, the ones that result in men being served job ads for jobs that have salaries over $200,000 at 6 times the rate of women. Right? Those are all very important, very granular issues that are invisible to the average person as an individual. In terms of institutional reforms, I think several things. One is I don't and have never understood why feminists haven't stormed school boards. I still don't understand it. The home and the family and schools are areas of traditionally reinforced women's power. So we should be using those much more effectively because women have parity representation in this country only in school boards, and that's true in other countries. But what happens is we don't migrate from school boards up through political systems into other office, and we need to be doing that. But if we systematically dealt with school boards, we would have great influence way beyond the technical representation that those school boards represent. That's one. The second thing is this public-private divide that is really used as a cudgel against women, we should be actively dissolving it. And the internet lets us do that. The distinction between virtual and real is also one that makes no sense to me. But this idea that there is a public kind of violence and a private kind of violence is also really unhelpful to us. And so if you take something like Femin, which is kind of an odd and controversial movement of feminist action, I will say that one thing about Femin that I like is that they show state physical male violence against naked women's bodies, say whatever you want about the kind of naked women's bodies they show, out in the open, right? And we don't see those things very much. I mean, because of these imbalances in media and institutional biases, that all gets erased. All that violence graphically, physically gets erased. And so I think that because the internet it flattens these hierarchies, we should be strategizing about what that means for us as feminists and how we can really use that flattening to bypass the status quo. So we know, for example, that schools reproduce gender, and they reproduce gender in ways that are anti-feminist explicitly. So why aren't we just going straight to kids? Why aren't we using technology to go straight to kids? That's what I think we should be doing, because kids are open-minded about these things. They understand in their own lives what inequity looks like, and these ideas really resonate with them. But there are so many institutional obstacles to that. But we now have a mechanism for bypassing those, and I think we need to use them.
Thank you. So I really can't leave without talking about the election. Especially with the role of technology, right, and media and coming together. So how do you, and connecting that to really eradicating violence, right, moving from awareness to eradication. How do you see what has happened in the US, right, positively moving forward, right? How do we move from misogyny to mass action, right? How do we use technology and media to do that, to eradicate violence?
Sure, that is a similar question that's on everyone's minds right now. I think of a couple of things. One of those is solidarity. Has to be critical right now, maybe more so than ever. As we go forward in this work, online and offline, we have to make sure that we are not leaving any group behind, that as we work on women's rights, we are working on all women's rights. We're not leaving trans women behind, we're not leaving immigrant women behind, we're not leaving women with disabilities behind. We can't compromise one group's rights to maintain or further another group's. That just has to be a fundamental part of what we're doing today. And I think related to that, what we could do is make sure that all of those people have the same access we do to technology and the tools that we use. to advocate for ourselves and others. I think also this is really going to be more and more critical is digital security around our activism. This has always been important, but now that we face a situation where some of the people whispering in Donald Trump's ear are the people who have led these campaigns against some of the work that we do. I mean, Soraya and I have been directly affected by attacks that some of these people in high-level positions now have influenced. And so there are people leading misogynistic white supremacist groups that are now in high power positions within, or will be soon, within the US government. And so there's going to be an even bigger backlash against us. I mean, the good thing that I keep thinking right now is a backlash means we're getting somewhere, right? That's one of the things that I keep holding on to. It means we were making huge strides, whether it's with the feminist movement or Black Lives Matters movement or the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, all of these things, we were moving forward hugely. And so I keep thinking of it as like the last gasp. And we just got to push forward until there's no breath left over there. And so digital security is going to be critical because the surveillance issue is going to explode and be more of an issue than it was before. Government surveillance, corporate surveillance, and those two intertwined of what activists are doing is something that's very concerning right now. And that goes for women's rights activists too. And that's why I can't say enough that women's rights activists need to think about the role of technology in their work, need to think about their own digital security. And one of the things that we can do, and this goes back to solidarity as well, is learn from women in other countries and how they have survived the kind of stuff that we're afraid is going to happen, and how they have continued organizing and mobilizing and kept their voices out there. I work with a lot of women around the world who have had their websites taken down, who have been hacked, who have had people follow them and threaten them online and offline, who have been, one of our Take Back the Tech campaigners, a group in Malaysia that was involved in a protest going on there, recently had their offices raided while we were in the middle of 16 days campaigning with them. So we need to learn from women in other countries who have been doing a kind of work that maybe we couldn't really imagine before, that we might find ourselves in that same situation soon. Because they have strategies and solutions that can be effective for us. And I would challenge everyone here to do something during these 16 days, to do something to improve your digital security.
And I think that the digital security goes hand in hand with digital citizenship. With, again, to go back to schools, this idea that children need to be taught empathy and compassion and other Trojan horse lessons about feminism, right? And so I think that there are a couple of things. One is the backlash that we're experiencing is global. And what we've seen time and time again is, particularly if there are women in politics or who are political actors, backlash against them is not coming necessarily from their own neighborhoods or their own political parties, which it does, or their own communities. It's coming from some other country. And so as feminists, we see that all the time. I mean, half of the harassment I get is coming from countries all over the world. It has nothing to do with what I'm saying about reproductive rights in Michigan, right? So I think we need to act locally, but we need to be really thinking globally. But again, that can be flipped over in our benefit because we have these powerful women's organizations working at the nexus of technology and anti-violence. And they are very, very, very supportive and very happy to always do this work together. The other thing, too, is I personally am really tired of sitting in rooms full of women, although I know you're all super people. But we have to find a way to get men in these rooms because we just keep talking to each other. And one way is just to ask, but often that comes down to, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. The other way is to publicly shame institutions. I run an organization that is working very hard to reduce online harassment and abuse. I do not believe in the public shaming of individuals. I have no problem with the public shaming of institutions, right? Because these institutions wield great power, and they have individuals in them who consistently say, I'm a good guy, I want to do the right thing. And the internet gives us unprecedented power to hold people accountable, to hold ourselves accountable, to hold our allies accountable, but to also hold that neutral, moderate, middle ground of people who are not acting accountable. And we should be strategizing along those lines. And then the last thing I'll say is that one of the issues we've always had is that we tend to work in our own spheres very well. So we work in these silos because those silos were established historically, and I think we should ignore them because we're always marginal in any area we seek. And that's true in the United States, whether you're a woman or a person of color or both at the same time. And so we need to find ways to leverage the connections between all of these different institutional areas, technology, the law, medicine, education, all of those, because we never reach enough critical mass to force institutional change. But if we can think about change at the interstices instead of it within these bubbles, I think we might find interesting different forms of success.
So my last question is around accountability that you brought up, right, and eradication of violence. How would you use the media and technology, given that that's a conversation we're having, to hold those in power or institutions accountable, right, if they're not interested in eradicating violence, right? How do we hold them accountable? How do we make sure that we use the shaming, right, to hold organizations and companies accountable that don't have women in power, right? Their boards of directors have like one woman, right, or two. How do we go about doing that?
Sure. I think Soraya and I both have some concrete experience in this area. One of the things the internet has been really useful for in terms of violence against women is building evidence. I mean, if anybody here has worked on online harassment or any kind of technology-related violence against women, you know that there's a lack of evidence. Like, we know it's this huge problem, but there's a lack of evidence backing that up. And one of the things that APC has done is worked with partners in local countries to gather evidence. We have a map where we ask people to map incidents of technology-related violence. And we worked with these countries and had maps specific to their countries. And as people would map cases, we picked some with the partners that we could do case studies of. And we gathered this map data and did these case studies and published research in these 7 countries, Pakistan, Philippines, Kenya, Mexico, et cetera. And from that, we created all these research products. And one of them, and I can thank Soraya for this idea a little bit, was a report card of how social media platforms approach violence against women.
And they hated it.
Yes.
Which was good. That was a good thing.
Because we looked at these countries specifically, and these cases, but then we looked at legal remedies, what corporations were doing, and what laws were out there. And we looked specifically at Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and how they approached women's rights. And we graded them in several areas. And I think the best score was a D in one area, but mostly they had Fs across the board. And so we created this infographic and put that out there, and it got media attention like that, in a way that we, this very diverse group of activists spread out around the world were not able to get attention before. It was in the Washington Post, it was in Time, it was in O Globo in Brazil, in about 100 media outlets around the world. And that got Twitter's attention and Facebook's attention, and they said, whoa, okay, we need to address this. And so with Soraya and some other people, we were able to start talking to them and say, you need to bring more women's organizations to the table, women's rights organizations from different countries. You need to be talking to them constantly. You need to fix these language barriers to reporting. It's a huge problem if women in Urdu cannot report the violence that they are experiencing because the reporting form is not in Urdu. Or maybe it is, but you don't have anybody on your staff, on your moderating staff, who can read the language. All of these barriers need to be fixed. And so we were able to put pressure through the media on these platforms, on these companies, to make these changes. Now it's been a long process. I mean, they've been slowly making changes. They're constantly making some improvements. Sometimes they go back a little bit, but we've been continuing to see a lot of changes. And now, I mean, you just saw a lot of them have made some changes in anticipation of how bad hate speech and online harassment are going to get because of the recent election.
So I think that it's America, and what you do is you take money from people and they pay attention to you. Right? They will pay attention to you if you embarrass them, and they'll pay attention to you if you take money from them. And so the campaign that we launched in 2013 came after 9 months of talking civilly and politely and trying to work together that yielded zero effect. And so what we did is we took images that we had either found, or all three of us were writers, or had written about, or that hundreds, if not thousands, of people had sent us, which I mean, there were live rapes in videos, there were women being beheaded, there were women being bludgeoned, there were women being trafficked. And every one of those images was on Facebook alongside advertising. So Facebook was not really responding, so we cut them out of the picture and we went straight to the advertisers in a very big public campaign that ended up with, there were 100 organizations around the world in our coalition, there were 60,000 tweets in 3 days, 5,000 letters, millions of dollars were involved, and that got people's attention. Now that was a case of hashtag activism, but I will note that the plan behind the hashtag activism was a very long-term, on-the-ground, real-world engagement that has yielded an extremely productive working relationship. It is still adversarial sometimes, but it's respectful, and we now have 30 organizations in the room that were not in the room before, and that's important. And of all of these platforms, I will say that I think Facebook has been by far the most receptive and has invested the most money. Twitter pays lip service to these ideas. Google and YouTube are huge, sprawling enterprises that once in a while, I know personally, I've introduced a group at Google to another group of Google who wants to do the same thing. I will say that there are genuinely good people trying to do really good work. They have zero feminist education. Zero. If it were possible to have less than zero, that's where we'd be, right? And so part of the work we constantly are doing is educating. And now, because we have memes, you can do that really easily. And I'm not joking. Like images, like the report card images, how long did you work on that? A year? 6 months?
Well, the research itself was several years.
Well, several years.
Yeah.
But the thing that got people's attention was literally a report card, an image of a report card, right? And so we have phenomenally talented, creative, funny people. Otherwise, you couldn't really be a feminist, right? So you can create these images that have viral impact. And because of the flattening of these media hierarchies, you can literally reach anyone in the world. You can reach anyone in the world with these messages. And so you should maybe focus on the top 20% of decision makers at major global transnational corporations that are proxy governments, like, right? Like that's what we should be doing. So.
Thank you. So I want to hear some closing remarks from the two of you about how we are moving forward.
Sure. One of the things that is giving me a lot of hope lately is that despite what feels like an and our major setbacks that we've faced recently. And as Soraya said, and many of you have said, this isn't just in the US where we're facing these setbacks. Feminist collectives, I mean, the work that I do is international, and we are seeing feminist collectives pop up all over the place. And it's amazing. It's an amazing feeling. And one of the things these women are really focusing on is creating content. They're being creative, and they're being strategic, and they're creating digital content that is feminist, that is unapologetically feminist, that is challenging norms, challenging gender norms, but also just challenging norms that enable violence against women and enable discrimination against women, that are trying to break down that sort of public-private problem that Soraya was talking about, that are saying that women have a right to be in this public space, whether it is on the street or on the internet. There's a group that we're working with called Luchadores in Mexico that is just innovative and creative and fun. I mean, you talked about we're fun and we're smart. I mean, fun has to be a part of this now, right? We've done a lot of drudgery for a long time. And I think that we can have fun when we're doing this work. That may seem a little counterintuitive when we're talking about violence against women, but when we're talking about cultural change and trying to keep people's attention on the media, on the internet these days, I think fun and creativity need to be a part of that. But Luchadores does a streaming internet TV show. And it's this small group of women who do this all totally volunteer. And every week they have a new show, and they interview women from different walks of life. And what they're trying to do is show an image of women that's counter to the dominant narrative in the media. And they just kind of do all of this themselves. And so now we're working with them to help other women learn these skills, to connect it to things like security when it comes to street harassment and security when it comes to online harassment. Because, as Soraya said, if you're going to take up the mantle and do this work online as well as offline, then you're going to need to learn how to face violence online, right? And so they're doing all this really cool work in Mexico. There are a lot of initiatives like that popping up all over. And I think that we can hold on to the fact that no matter the horrible stuff that we are seeing in the media happening, there are these awesome feminists popping up everywhere. Girls are learning about feminism on the internet. I think for a while it wasn't cool to be a feminist. And now suddenly it is becoming cool to be a feminist. And their feminism is shaped by what they see us doing online. And I mean, that's a fantastic thing. I think that's very hopeful.
And I want to stress too, the work that we do, I feel, is really, really grassroots in a different way. It's not the same kind of physical grassroots that we're used to thinking about. But last year, we organized with the Berkman Center, the Society for Internet and Society, the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, something called the International Workshop on Internet Misogyny, and got 50 people together in this space. And what really struck me about that was that all of us are working intensely in our own countries, but we desperately need to be working together, which we do. And it comes down sometimes to, you know, a woman who is in a village in India who might be killed by her family because someone saw a picture of her in Facebook. And through this network, we can actually manage to have that photograph taken down. I mean, we're talking about really granular levels of intervention while we're simultaneously trying to shape the structure of the technology so that that never happens in the first place. And both things have to happen at once. And the reason I think that's important is because I don't really think we understand, and we won't understand for many years, what the effect of girls and women not being isolated in their homes anymore is. We don't know what that, we are just seeing the beginning of that. So that before, even 25 years ago when this campaign began, a young girl in Australia couldn't reach out to people around the world and say, this happened to me in my school, and have a million people say, that's horrible, we're with you. I mean, that makes a difference, right? And we see that over and over and over again. So although I'm really sad and anxious and pretty much feel like a rod of anger, I do think those are all positive things. Like, I think that ability for us to work with people and each other all over the world in supportive ways is a strong one. It's really powerful.
Thank you both. So I think we are going into the Q&A session that I think you all have been waiting for very patiently. So Yakin and Charlotte.
In 2012, the UN started discussing again whether there should be a fifth World Conference on Women. And women's groups were very divided on whether to go ahead or not. And actually, I was working at UN Women at the time, and I strongly advocated for having a conference. And a lot of people, including probably on the panel, argued against, on the grounds that the international community was in a bad state and was going to roll back advances in women's rights. Turkey offered to host. And, you know, it's one of the great historical what-ifs. You know, what if there had been a Fifth World Conference last year and, you know, the Arab world, women of the Arab world had come forward to say, this is our feminism, this is our approach to culture, etc. One of the things that I kept thinking about at the time was, it's an era of social media. It didn't exist in '95. What difference could it have, or could it make? Maybe the question shouldn't be speculative, but what do you think about a 20th World Conference on Women in 2020? You know, would that be incredibly dangerous? Are we in enough control of social media to control the narrative?
I was on the served on the committee, Council of Europe Committee on Prevention of Torture, and the treaty that defines the mandate of the committee is very problematic, but nobody dares to question them, because once you start touching it, you don't know how it's going to end. So there is that serious fear that we will not be able to maintain the level of human rights standards that we currently have in any field. Having said that, I see an incredible merit in holding some kind of a conference, but we need to rethink how we want to structure it. Because I think there is a whole new generation of women who, and I have heard this from women themselves, they said, you had it, and we don't have it. And I think there is a need to sort of reach out to the younger generations of women. And aside from this, there's also an incredible value in engagement. I mean, the fact that Turkey, 2012, was still sort of the period when the liberal, quote-unquote, politics prevailed. But I think it's helpful to get these kinds of people to address these issues. It doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of direction that we want. Engagement can also be in a very detrimental way. Let's not forget the engagement of these many hardliners now in human rights issues. But 2013, the adoption of the Human Rights Council resolution on the protection of the family is disastrous. It's disastrous. I mean, that notion of the family was promoted for many years, but now it's in a UN document. So these fears are real. But that doesn't mean we should resort to passivity. I think we have to confront these, but be more imaginative to anticipate these dangers ahead of time and try to find strategies to counter them. It's a challenge.
It's kind of related to what Anne-Marie said, and also what Soraya said. I love that name. On including men. Because one of the rhetorics online I've been hearing since the election is this notion that the white male feels so left out. You know, that there's all this, like the fear that, and it's part, white males here, okay. And the fear that all these, like Black Lives Matter, gender equality, disability, LGBT rights, everybody's getting a stage, and then these poor white males, you know, disappearing, or they're going to be a minority all of a sudden, and who's paying attention to them? So in that sense, I do agree that we need to include them in the conversation, but there's also this other group, youth, especially feminists, who feel like they're finally getting their voice. Now, if we let the white male into the room, our voice is going to be jeopardized. And where do we go from here? I mean, obviously, one of the best advice I heard is like listening to people. So, I mean, is it okay to actually listen to these white males that are so scared? And somebody said that too, that in a lot of ways, this backlash is because we have advanced so much. So we could celebrate that, but that's not the answer either. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
I find that entire plaint pretty masturbatory, right? So we have no silencing of white men happening in this country. We have none. Like, that's demonstrably true, right? So what we actually have is kind of a rejection of modernity in that people don't care what's true and don't even recognize the irony of the identity politics play that just happened, right? And so for years in my writing, which is all I can think to do, and in my advocacy work, I try and reverse the trajectory of how we think about safe spaces and identity politics and all of these things, because, in 2012, or 13, when I walked into a room at a tech company, what I heard was, "We're so glad you are here representing women, and we would like to invite you to the room with all our other special interest groups," which multiple levels of wrong. Too long to go into. But my response to that eventually, after going along and being polite, was the only special interest group I will ever talk about are young white men. Because young white men are coding, they're owning, they're getting the money, they're running for Congress, they're flooding Wall Street, they're getting movie deals in Hollywood, and so that's who I want to talk about. And so when I get back, "Oh, you're all snowflakes that need safe spaces," I'm like, no, those are the safe spaces. Every single one of our institutions is a safe space for a man like Donald Trump and everybody that's rushing into the White House with him. And so that, I think, comes with redefining these words. And I don't want to not be empathetic. I understand it's really hard to feel silenced. I do. Right? So check, I got it. So can now we have a different conversation?
Yeah, I just want to add two things to that because I think that's a great answer. I also want to remind people, 2 million, this notion that somehow this point of view won, really we have to examine the Electoral College, the voting system, the gerrymandering, the number of people who were intimidated not to vote. I think we're drawing the wrong conclusions. Not that we don't need to address everyone who feels left out, and that would include the white men and white women who voted, but not because that is their reality, but because the reality is that they need to understand their role in a new world. I do think that men should be in conversations about feminism, not because we should be hearing their pain, but because they should be participating in how they want to be in this new world. And some of them are. There's a lot of talk about the 53% of women, but of white women who voted for Trump, and it is painful for many of us. But that means 47% of white women who voted didn't. So that means we have a lot of people who actually are thinking about this new world, and maybe we need to extend that conversation rather than get caught in the trap of, as you said, a mythical disempowerment. But there may be a different kind of inclusion in the conversation that we need to think about. And to pick up on the Fifth World Conference on Women, I think the question is exactly what Joaquin said. Can we find a way to do it that isn't about a platform? if we could have a gathering, even if it exposed the rifts, after all, Beijing was also exposing the huge gap between what won and the very strong backlash that was there. But I think the question is, what is it that we're trying to get? Because just getting a document, not only would we get a worse document, I think, but it doesn't even motivate. If we could think about a new way to conceptualize what the getting together means, it could be a very important thing to do.
I don't think that it's a matter of men sitting around with us and telling us what they think, because, sorry, we don't care. But I think they need to be talking to each other. That's one of the best things they could do, is just talk to each other. Call out rape culture when you see it. When men are invited to speak on panels, make sure there are women on that panel. Recommend women for that panel. Cede the floor to women sometimes. That would be a huge thing, rather than participating in the organizing. I think is just for them to look around their own lives and see where they can make those changes.
Can I add one last thing to that? Because I have thought about this a lot, and I don't really think any of this will happen until it happens around dinner tables. So, if the 100 people in this room took 5 men with them each, that'd be 500 more people. I mean, I've been married for 24 years yesterday, and my husband is like a nice, upstanding white guy, and it took a long time for him to be able to say white supremacy. Now it rolls off the tongue, right? And we have a conversation about how long that took and what it meant and what it felt like, and that's hard. It's really hard when you have to go to bed with someone and you voted for Clinton and he voted for Trump. That's what happened, right? 30% of men in this country did not know who their wives were going to vote for. That's astounding. That says everything to me. I'm like, okay, how do we get that to be 0? Because then you've had all those conversations. And then those people go to work and they have those conversations there.
I just want to make another point with respect to getting men engaged. We have to ask the question, what stake do men have in engaging with the feminist discourse? And the answer would not come from us, it would come from men. And I have seen when there is an issue which they really identify with, what men are out there. So mechanically getting, I appreciate the few gentlemen who are sitting here, but it's not whether they're sitting here or not, but why they are here and what interest do they have in it. I think that's the more important thing. For example, there was one incident not long ago in Turkey. A young nurse, when she left the hospital going home, she was kicked by this guy because she was wearing shorts. The next day, men and women were out on the streets wearing shorts in protest of this. So nobody organized that. It was a very spontaneous. So I think what stake men have is a very important question. If we have an answer to that, I think we should be able to communicate it so that and share it with men. And there is some form of a, not very strong yet, but a men's movement, pro-feminist men's movement. And I don't mean the more, the popular ones, but some serious masculinity thinking. And maybe we need to engage with that too. I remember when I first came into the UN in 1997 as director of INSTRO, I proposed to, as one of the research areas, deconstructing masculinity. I was objected violently. Some of the women said to me, "Oh, we are feminists, we don't want to deal with men." And then another discourse was, "Oh, let us not harm the dignity of our men." And I have, after several times receiving this kind of a reaction within the UN system, I said, well, maybe I'm wrong. Until in one session before the Beijing +5, we had a panel. At that time, I was, I think, in Doha already. I'm not sure. Yes, I think so. And there was a panel on CSW. There was a professor, Somalian from England. He talked about the role of men. And then after that, some of the delegates, Patricia Flohr, you might remember from the German delegation, very smart woman. She came to me and said, Ms. Arthur, you used to talk about the role of men. Can we discuss this? So it took a man to get the ears again. So it's a difficult area. Women for long have resisted engagement with men. So I think now we need to ask to ourselves, why do we want to engage, and what is the stake for men? And then I think move towards modalities of where we want to act together.
Soraya and Sara could maybe give us some examples of digital security strategies around our activism. And I know both of you, and perhaps even Charlotte and can perhaps speak to actual physical safety measures that you have had to take because of online and in real life threats. Because I feel like more things are happening. We're seeing this increase in hate crimes. I've seen things that I've had my own issues recently, and it makes me think. I don't want to be a violent person to counter violence, but I'm also not going to turn the other cheek if someone is going to be violent towards me. So what is my option? They talked a lot about the Second Amendment rights during this election. Yeah. They want to take away our guns. But if one side has all the guns and the other side doesn't have any guns, then what? What are we setting ourselves up for? So maybe just some sort of conversation around actual safety measures online and in real life, either that you've put in place yourself or have heard about that have been successful.
Right, so I'll give you a few tips and then some good resources you could go to for more. But the first things that come to mind are Google yourself and find out what's already out there about you. And things that you want to look for in particular are if your private information, where you live, your phone number. If people can look at the information that's out there online and figure out where you are or where to find you, that would be a key thing. Think about what you're putting on social media and how that may identify where you are. I mean, sometimes your phone is set up maybe to put your location when you take a picture. So watch for things like that. And also, you might post pictures that readily identify your location. I wouldn't say online where I'm staying. When I tweeted we're in New York City to do this, I wouldn't say where I'm staying. Things like that. If you're doing activism and you know that people might be paying attention to that kind of thing. I would also say use two-factor authentication with certain passwords whenever you can. Like if you use Gmail, that's a spot that allows two-factor authentication.
It's an easy setting in all of these platforms.
Yes.
Just go to security, privacy, and switch on two-factor authentication.
And it makes it harder for people to hack your accounts. So things like that are critical. I think also if you're using cloud technology, be really careful about what you put into those clouds. And your apps, the more apps you have on your phone, the more vulnerable you are. And we at APC really advocate the use of open source because that means we can all see what's going into making an app is totally transparent. So that can be very helpful. But to find out more and to learn more about what I was just talking about, if any of it was confusing for you, there are a lot of guides out there. Some of them are really complex. Some of them are a little simpler. Take Back the Tech has we have a digital safety roadmap that covers cyberstalking, hate speech, and blackmail, so-called revenge porn. We don't like that term because it's not always revenge and it's not porn. But covers those three areas, has some strategies in there, and then we have a safety toolkit that gets down into the nitty-gritty tech stuff. And you can find that at takebackthetech.net. One really good resource is Community Red. Shauna Delavu of Community Red just wrote a piece for Medium after the election that has some very easy to understand tips with some of the main things that you should just go ahead and do right now. So look for that. And it's written in a way that any of us can understand and take action on, and that you could sit in maybe like the next hour and do most of those things.
Also, I strongly urge you to look at the Take Back the Tech, like the whole website, because it's fantastic. We also, at the Women's Media Center, we have a website called the Speech Project, where we explain what online harassment tactics look like, because people really don't know what some of them might be. And so it's just good to know what those are, and it helps you take the precautions that you need. We also list a lot of these guides, different levels that people can look at. And I will say this, because so much of the internet is photo intensive now, you should be aware of who's tagging you and whether you are being tagged. And women activists, women writers, women politicians, women are much more likely to be turned into porn through photo manipulation, and much more likely to also have their children implicated in threats. And that's just something that's a reality and you need to know. So you may, for example, if you know you're about to do something that's very public, you may, if you have kids, ask them to lock down their social media. I mean, you can take precautions so that everyone's aware and just better, has a better sense of privacy.
In terms of the not online security, actually, I would also recommend a source, which is www.awid.org. There have been several books done by women internationally on how to protect yourself and your organization. There are many different strategies, but at the core of it is groups that decide they will keep track of each other, so that somebody in your group knows where you are and where you're going to be, and at least provides some ability if you suddenly disappear, there's somebody aware of that, because many of us move in the world as if we could be gone for days and nobody might not notice or realize something had happened. So, but it's much more than that there, and these were strategies that particularly came out of the Mesoamerica Women's Human Rights Initiative in relation to the violence against women in Mexico and Central America that's been really intense and has really, what we know, we've had several activists killed, but that at least have begun to come up with what you can do to protect yourself and the office when you're in those situations.
I'm going to add one other thing, too. Shauna, our friend whose guide she recommended on Medium, she runs the only women-led security firm, pretty much, in this space. And what she says, which I will repeat, is that as women, we already know this. We already know how to do this. We already know that we're being surveilled, especially if you are a black woman in America. That's happening. So it's a matter of taking the lessons we've already had to incorporate into our lives and moving them into a different medium.
We have to close right now, but we have 1 hour where you could actually ask questions from the panelists. So please join me in thanking our panelists right now.